Expressions are essential for making motion graphics templates because it's the coding language that After Effects uses that actually allows your templates to be customized. So you're gonna need to have a basic grasp on how they work, and we're even gonna be using a couple of expressions that are pretty advanced. But don't worry, even if you've never used expressions before, I'm gonna walk you through every step of the process so that by the end of this class, you'll feel totally comfortable implementing them into your own templates. And if you're completely new to expressions, this video is exactly for you because I'm gonna walk you through the basics of expressions and how they function inside of After Effects. First of all, what is an expression? Well, expressions is the code language that After Effects uses to be able to do complex things. That code can be written on basically any keyframeable property, and one really easy way to think about expressions is being able to do anything that keyframes can do. So if you can control something by hand using keyframes, you can write an expression to do the same thing. The benefit of expressions is that it can make really complex things executed automatically. Now, expressions are actually based on the JavaScript code language. You might have heard of that before. It's used a lot online. But the expressions code itself is not the full JavaScript library, so you don't have access to the entire code library that is JavaScript. However, recently Adobe did switch over to fully supporting JavaScript inside of After Effects. So if I go down here into my project settings and over to the expressions tab, you see that my expressions engine is set to JavaScript, and that should be the default for you if you're using the most recent version of After Effects. If I click on this, I can switch to Legacy Extend Script, and Extend Script is Adobe's term for the expressions library. But using the entire JavaScript library just opens up a lot more possibilities. We're really not going to get that deep into it in this class, but I'd suggest that you leave this set to JavaScript. All right, so that's what expressions code is, but what exactly can we do with it? Well, there's a lot that you can do with it, way more than we're going to be able to cover in one class, but here's a few examples. One way to think about an expression is kind of like a parent from one layer to another. So if I were to make a solid layer that's 100 pixels by 100 pixels, I can parent this expressions text to that solid, and it will adopt the transform controls of this layer. So if I rotate it, it's going to follow that. If I scale it up or down, move it around, the text layer is going to move with it. One way to use an expression is to basically parent or link one property to another. So if I take this parenting relationship off and I open up the rotation by pressing R on the keyboard for each of these layers, you'll notice there's another pick whip right here, and this is called the property pick whip. What this allows me to do is basically parent one property to another. So if I were to grab this property pick whip for the rotation value of the text layer and bring it to the rotation value of the white solid layer, now these numbers are red, and that's indicating there is an expression applied to this property. And if I rotate the white solid, the rotation of the text is adopting the same value. It's not parented to that layer. I can still move it around, scale it up or down, and that's not going to affect anything. But the rotation value is always going to match the white solid's rotation value. Now watch what happens if I switch to my rotation tool and try to modify the rotation of this layer. I can't. It's locked, and that's because the expression is overriding my rotation controls. So I can change the number down here, but as soon as I let go, it goes back to the same value that the expression is giving it. That's really important to understand. The expression is going to override whatever value you put in here unless you account for that value within your expression. Another thing you'll notice that this adds is a little drop-down arrow. So if I click on that, we can see expression on the rotation property. Right over here, we have a line of code. This is our expression. So if I give myself a little more room and click into this, we can see that this little editor for the expressions is actually really useful because it gives us color coding for this JavaScript language, which can be very helpful for identifying different parts of your code. Now, I didn't have to write any of this code. All I did was use the parent pick whip to select the rotation property, and it automatically changed it for me. If you're nervous about expressions, this should make you a lot more comfortable because you don't need to know how to write all of this out. You just need to be able to use this property pick whip to grab something, and After Effects fills it in for you. Now, if you noticed right over here, we have some controls. There's another pick whip, and this one is called the expression pick whip. Now, this was not visible before we used the property pick whip. So let me just get rid of all of this code real quick and show you that expression goes away. Those controls for the expression go away. But if I undo and bring that back, this is going to do the exact same thing as the property pick whip. So if I were to grab this, click and drag and go to the rotation, it's going to fill in that exact same code. It's just that that was not visible before I added the expression. And when Adobe introduced this property pick whip, the expression pick whip had already existed. So the only way to get access to that would be to add an expression manually, which you can do by pressing Alt on PC or Option on a Mac and click on the stopwatch. That adds an expression, and then we see those controls. But Adobe made it a little bit easier on us now that we have this property pick whip. So all I have to do to start my expression is grab something, and it automatically fills in that text for me. So we have this rotation of this text layer linked to the rotation of the white solid layer. But what if I wanted to link it to a different property? Well, I actually can do that. So I'm going to press Shift-T with that white solid selected to bring up the opacity. And what happens if instead of linking this to the rotation, I link that to the opacity? I'll let go, and my expressions text rotated to this weird angle. But if you'll notice, it's 100 degrees and the opacity is 100%. So if I turn this opacity value down, look at that. The expressions text is rotating. So even though these are two completely different properties, the expression code is able to translate the value of this opacity to degrees on the rotation. And it's a one-to-one translation. So, whatever percentage this opacity value is going to be plugged in to this number value, which is actually measured in degrees. So this isn't necessarily a very helpful expression, but it's just illustrating the point that you can link any number to another number. But regardless of how you're using expressions, the end result is always the same. It's going to generate a value to plug in or output to the value that you've applied the expression to. These can be simple links between properties. They can be calculations with complex equations. They can be based off of multiple layers and multiple properties. And they can even have conditions so that if checkboxes are checked or not checked, different values will be calculated and output to this value. It seems really complex, and it is. It's a really big topic, and expressions can do so much. Possibilities are pretty much endless. But there are only a handful of expressions that you really need to understand to start taking advantage of using them in your own work, and even fewer for making motion graphics templates like the one that we'll be doing in this class. But let's look at another way that we can use expressions. Instead of just referencing another property, we can actually use expressions to generate values that aren't based on anything else in the comp. These are through what are called methods. And that's just a JavaScript term for a piece of the language that allows you to generate something. For instance, we could generate a random number value for the rotation for every single frame of our comp. And to do that, I'm just going to edit this expression and erase it. And I'm going to start typing the random method, which looks like this. I just type out random, and you see that as I start typing, After Effects gives me this autocomplete window. This is the expressions library, and it's giving me what it thinks I'm trying to type. There are other options in here that have random in the word, but if I double click on it, it will autocomplete for me. That text is blue, letting me know that is a method. It's not referencing another part of the layer or the comp or a property. And then it gives me these parentheses. It automatically gives me opening and closing parentheses. And when you see these parentheses, that means that we can add more to this method to generate a specific number. Now, again, I don't want to overwhelm you. I'm not going to get deep into how this random method works, but if I just apply the expression, I don't actually have to fill any numbers in between those parentheses. You see that my value is now 0.8. And if I just play this back by hitting the space bar, look at that. The text is kind of vibrating. Because on every single frame of my comp, After Effects is now generating a random number. The reason why it's rotating so little is because by default it's generating a value between 0 and 1. So that's why I have 0.1 on this frame, 0.9, there we have a whole value of 1. It's never going to go above 1 or below 0. But if I went back into this expression in between those parentheses, I could put in any number. So let's say 20 and then click off. And now it's going to generate a number between 0 and 20. If I play this again, my random rotation is going to be a lot more. But what if I want it to go below 0? Well, then I can actually add in a second number. So the first number that you type in will be the low end of the random, and the second number will be the high end. So if I put in -20 and separate it by a comma, then I have the minimum and maximum random values. I can click off, and now it's going to randomly generate a number between -20 and 20 and fill that in on every single frame of this comp. So that's one method. But let's say that this is going a little too wild. I don't want it to be so random. Well, there's another method called wiggle. And this one you're probably familiar with. If you've ever used expressions, wiggle is probably something that you've come across. But to write it out, I'm just going to type wiggle. And again, it autofills for me. I'll double click to autocomplete. And it puts the cursor right there between the parentheses for me. Now, this particular expression does not work without any values between those parentheses. I clicked off and it broke. Nothing is rotating, and I even get this little error icon. If I click on that, it's telling me that I have a warning. After Effects warning, the expression is disabled. There's an error at line 1 in the property rotation of layer 2 expressions in comp source rect at time. But the error down here is that the wiggle method needs between 2 and 5 arguments. So an argument is what goes between these parentheses. Those numbers we put on the random method, that was the argument. The argument was give me a number between -20 and 20. For wiggle, there is no default value like random had of generating a number between 0 and 1 if nothing was written in there. I have to give it between 2 and 5 arguments. The two most basic required arguments are the frequency of this wiggle and the amplitude of the wiggle, and they're in that order. So the frequency, I want it to happen, let's say, 4 times a second. That's what that value is measured in, the number of times per second. Then I separate that by a comma to give it the second argument, which is the amplitude, or how far this value can change with the wiggle, and I'll say 180 degrees, okay? Don't worry about the other arguments that could be put in here. This is all I need for right now. I'll click off and play this back, and now I'm getting a random number on every frame, but it's wiggling. It's kind of easing back and forth between values instead of just randomly giving me a unique value every single time. So you can kind of think of it like a smooth random. Now, I again want to reiterate that you do not need to know how all of this is working. You don't need to know all of the different expression methods and arguments and what they mean and how many of them you need to have and what each one represents. This is something that you're going to learn over time and start memorizing as you use it. But if you ever forget, you can't remember what order these values are supposed to be in, there's actually a little cheat sheet in After Effects that will help you remember. So take a look at this little arrow right here. This is the expression language menu. If I click on it, this is the entire expressions library, and it's separated out into categories. You see that there's a random numbers category, and that's where we can find random. But underneath random, we also have random max value or array, as well as min value or array, max value or array. And this is the cheat sheet part that I'm talking about. This is telling us what the arguments within those parentheses could be. If you put one number in, just one, it's going to be the maximum value that that random method is going to generate. And it'll return a value between 0 and whatever you type in. If you put 2 numbers in separated by a comma, it'll be between the minimum value and the maximum value, which is what we did. And if we search around here a little bit and go to property category, there's the wiggle expression. So this is going to list out all of the different arguments that can be put into here. And this is actually something I should point out. Not every method requires that you use every argument. For wiggle, we just used the first 2, which was the frequency and the amplitude. 3, 4, and 5 are much more complex. I've actually never even touched them, if that tells you anything. But the point of this is that if you forget which one comes first, frequency or amplitude, just come down to the expressions library, find the particular property or method that you are looking for, and this will tell you exactly what you need to know. The other thing you can do is use Google. JavaScript is a massively used and documented code language, and you can find really in-depth and clear explanations into any method, argument, calculation that you could think of online. And because After Effects uses the entire JavaScript library, if you see it in an expression, somebody has talked about it on the internet, and you can find explanations very quickly and easily just by Googling it. All right, let me undo and get back to where we were controlling just one property by the other. So let's take a look now at how this expression is written and what exactly After Effects is getting out of it. Well, first of all, I want to point out all of these periods, these dots. You can think of these periods as kind of separators in a hierarchy, and the overall line of code as kind of a path. So the first section of this code says this comp. This is the beginning of the path. After Effects is starting by saying, where do I need to look for a value? So we're going to tell After Effects this comp, the comp that we are in. And that kind of implies that you can look somewhere other than this comp. And that's exactly right. You can actually reference properties in other comps. But for this example, we're looking at this comp that we're in. Then we've got the dot, the period separator, which is telling After Effects what's next. Well, after we're looking in this comp, where do we look next? Then we are going to look at a layer. Okay, so a layer within this comp, and this next section in between parentheses and in between quotes, we have a proper case name, white solid 1, which is exactly the name of this layer. So that's how we're telling After Effects to look at a layer named white solid 1. Okay, then we have another period. This period is the next separator. It's saying, okay, what next? After we look at that layer, what do you want to see next? Well, then go into the transform controls. That would be this little drop down right here, the transform controls. Okay, cool. So we're looking at the transform controls. Another period. What next? The opacity property. There we go. Opacity property 100. And at that point, After Effects is like, okay, I know what I'm looking for now. The opacity property value. And I'm going to take that value because there's no other expressions or code after that. And I'm going to take that value and plug it straight into the property that this expression is written on, which is the rotation for that text layer. Again, you do not need to know how to write out code like this. It is not something that I do regularly either. I use the property pick whip or the expression pick whip constantly. But it is really helpful to understand the structure of an expression so that you can identify problems if things start to not work, and you can better read what's being written inside of this code window. So that's the very basics of expressions and how they function inside of After Effects. Don't worry if you're feeling overwhelmed. I can remember back to when I started using expressions, I was completely turned off to the idea of using code in my motion graphics. But once you actually start using them and you see the power and the possibilities that they open up inside of your designs, you're never gonna go back. So don't worry if you've never used them before. If this was a very overwhelming video, that's okay. The rest of this class, we're gonna use very specific expressions, and I'm gonna walk you through each one of them very slowly. We're gonna do a lot of repetition so that by the end of this class, you're gonna feel totally comfortable implementing them into your own designs.